My name is Dianne Bergant. I'm a Sister of St. Agnes from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and I am Professor Emerita of Old Testament Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I'd like to share with you a reflection on biblical foundation, my understanding, biblical foundation of some of what the Holy Father says in his document, Misericordia Vultus, which means the face of mercy. So we're talking about mercy. He calls on us to look at certain passages that demonstrate the mercy of God. The first, and what I consider perhaps the fundamental passage in the Bible that speaks about the mercy of God, is found in Exodus 34, verse 6. This is a passage that belongs to the account or the story of the golden calf. Now, the context of that, very simply, is the golden calf is a story showing the offense of the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, after they have been led out of slavery in Egypt, entered into a covenant with God, a covenant that fundamentally means you are my special people and I will be your God. And we both have responsibilities in this covenant. In the ancient world, that was a serious legal relationship, a legal pact. And people entered into a legal pact knowing what their respective responsibilities were. And in this legal pact of Israel, the responsibility of God is, I will be your God, which means I will care for you, I will protect you, I will be provident. You're mine. You're mine. But also, I'm yours. And you have a responsibility as well. And for the Israelites in that story, the responsibility was the law. And we've got to be careful how we understand law. Probably a better way of understanding what it means comes from one of the Christian saints who says, Christians, you're Christians, now act like it. So law does not make us Christians, but rather being Christians, obeying the law means, and this is how we are Christian. And if you look at the law, the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments are really directives. The Hebrew word for law is Torah. We understand it very, very narrowly. We think that in a certain sense, what they are really legislation, when in fact they're directives. That's another translation of the word Torah. It tells us how to act. But we act out of our relationship, like in a family, like the husband and wife. They don't do what they do because there are laws in the house. And when we talk about a pre-marriage arrangement, that has to do with property. But seldom. Once I heard in the news that before a couple got married, they wrote down what they expected of each other. I looked at that and realizing I'm not in a marriage, but any relationship I've ever been in, if you write down what you expect of the other person, I can't imagine that will last long. Because what we expect of another person should come out of their love for us, just as my love will motivate me to do certain things. That's probably how we should understand law. So in Israel, now they are related to God by law, or they are related to God by a way of living, a way of living that comes out of their love. So that's what we find in Exodus, but the people violated it. And God's response to that was mercy, not punishment, mercy. So when we talk about the mercy in the New Testament, again, Jesus is the face of God's mercy. So if you want to understand something about the mercy of God, you look at the mercy of Jesus. And in the New Testament, there's a special word that we find that speaks about the interior sentiment that really shows a relationship, and everything else comes out of that relationship. So it's the relationship of mercy that causes us to forgive. It's the relationship of mercy that causes us to be just in a situation. It is the relationship. It's not the law It's the relationship. The law is simply a directive that helps us to be faithful. Now, when we get into the New Testament, there's one story that speaks about the mercy of God with a different word because we're now in Greek. But it speaks about an interior relation, splanknon. And in the story of the prodigal father, not the prodigal son, I think that story is about the father. When the father sees the son coming, he runs to him. Why? Because of this, that word is in there. He was filled with compassion. There's another story that speaks about compassion. And it also speaks about the lack of compassion. It's found in Matthew's gospel. It's also found in another gospel, but it's in Matthew's gospel. It's frequently referred to as the unforgiving servant. Now, don't concentrate primarily on forgiving. Concentrate on the interior dimension, the interior sentiment that causes forgiving or that is expressed in forgiving. So it's that interior sentiment. The story is, in one story, and in Matthew it's called, it begins with a question, about loving, love which comes out of this compassion. Jesus tells a story about servants, a master and a servant. In another version, it's a king, but this one talks about a master and a servant. And the servant owes the master a tremendous amount of money. Now, one wonders, why is it always men in the stories? We've got to remember it's a patriarchal system. And so primarily it would be the man of the family who would, be dealing with money, administering money. So it's the man who is in debt. The whole family is in debt, but this man is in debt. And he goes to his master who asks for an accounting. You owe me something. I really want the money. And the servant says, please forgive me. Give me time. Give me time and I'll work it out. Now, in this society, if you owe something, if you owe money and you can't pay, you're thrown in jail. As a child, I never understood that. How can he pay when he's not working, earning money to pay? And the answer is, your family pays. So you're thrown in jail and your family pays your debt. In a certain sense, the only place in our society that I can think of where that still works is when you're thrown in jail and someone else pays your bail, bails you out. All right? So you're dependent on someone else. So this man owes money. He is in debt to the master, and he's dependent on his family. And if he can't do it, his whole family will be thrown into jail. It's a different economic system. But what he suggests, give me time. And what does the master do? Here is this special word. He is filled with compassion. So what he has is this needy man. We're dealing in an economic system here. This needy man. And so what the master does is forgive him. But he forgives him because, as the text says, he is filled with this compassion. So what happens? The servant goes out, now forgiven the debt because of the compassion, has no compassion on another servant who owes him a small debt. So what happens? The servant who owes him a small debt asks, give me time, and I'll work it off. And the servant says no. So he lacks this compassion. The servant says no, and has the man and his family thrown into jail until the debt is paid. Now, the master hears about this and calls this servant, the unforgiving servant, calls him in and says to him, you unforgiving servant. Now, they may not be the words, but that's the sense of it. I forgave your debt because I had compassion. And you go out and somebody owes you a much smaller debt and you do not forgive him. And so what does he say? Have that family, have the man and his family cast into jail. now what do we have here? What is the story all about? It's not about money, though money is part of the details of the story. It's like painting a picture, and every brush is important. The stroke is important for the whole picture. But it's the picture we're concerned about. So it's the primary story about this splanknon. And remember, as I said, that word means we're talking about God. So the master is a representation of God and shows how God works. Or it could be the master is Jesus, who is the face of God's mercy. But it's quite clear, here's where mercy is. Primarily, this mercy, this interior dimension, this interior sentiment, out of which all the other actions flow, is really what comes from God, because the word is always associated only with God's attitude toward us. As we found in an earlier story, the story of the prodigal father. Same kind of mercy for someone who owes something. One could say someone who is not trustworthy, someone who has sinned against the one who gives the mercy. So it's a story about God, but it's also a story about how we are to deal with other people.
In life, we are not alone. We live with and among people. We constantly enter into contact and relationship with others. Some of these relationships are very formal and superficial, but some are very deep and intimate. How do relationships work? We can all easily relate with those relationships that have been wounded, which are sometimes even bleeding. Father Martin Padovani, SVD, has written a book called Healing Wounded Relationships. It is the result of his many years of work as a marriage counselor. He deals with some of the very simple but pertinent topics like communications, listening, intimacy, forgiveness, reconciliation, and dealing with anxiety and fear. And of course, a very practical question: how do you make a marriage work? You will surely be enriched by this book. You should get it for yourself, or maybe get a copy for a relative or a friend. Be blessed by this book and improve your relationships.
Call the number on the screen or email us to get your copy. You can also place your order by visiting our website. Do it today.
So these stories are not simply, or particularly this story, is not simply a story about God. It is a story about us as well. But notice where our mercy comes from in this story. It does not come primarily from our personality. Though it may be easier for us to be merciful. It's easy to be merciful if no one's offended you. If no one has offended your family, if you live a very mild, complacent, and relatively prosperous life. And if you do, I'd like to know where you live, because everyone has some kind of a situation where we are offended, we are overlooked. It doesn't have to be primary abuse, though that's something else as well. But I'm quite sure that everyone has felt overlooked. You weren't invited to the party. You were not given the promotion. Overlooked, to say nothing about not particularly liked, not included. The kid who's never chosen to be on the team. So we have something like that in our lives. So when we talk about mercy, it's not simply because life has been easy, so it's easy for us. Or because life has, or because we have that personality. So in a certain sense, it is because in a very important sense, not just a side sense, in a very important sense, this story says that if Jesus is the face of the mercy of God, then we are the face of the mercy of Jesus. It's, I think, or maybe it's just me, but I can't believe that. It's easier to think of being treated mercifully, of being forgiven, as both of these, or I shouldn't say both, both of these servants are asking for some kind of forgiveness. It's easy to ask for forgiveness and being told you are forgiven. To ask for a favor that we need and being given the favor, that's not hard. But it's very difficult to be the one who then administers it to another. It's very difficult to show mercy to another. But that's what we're asked to do. It's easy for us to forgive. It's hard for us, to forgive others. So this story then shows the flow of the mercy of God. And it calls on us to be the presence of the mercy of God in this world. And I will be very clear. I'll be the first one to say, this is not easy. When we grow up, if we do grow up, many of us just get older, but when we really grow up, we learn that other people can be chosen. And that does not really insult us. We can, as we say, get over it. It's very difficult to get over and forgive many, to show mercy. I remember the first time I took Pax Christi's vow of nonviolence. And in that vow, we promised to try in our lives to be nonviolent, which is a recognition. It's not easy to be nonviolent, even if we live in a nonviolent situation. It's not easy, but we promise to try. Now, I'm not a mother with children for whom I'm responsible, but if I was, I don't know if I would be nonviolent if anyone attacked my child. Now, not that I would strike back in punishment, but I might be violent in trying to protect my child. Now, I remember when I took the vow of nonviolence, which is, in a certain sense, easy to say because I don't live in a violent world in the same way as many other people do. But my mother was aged. And I remember wondering if anyone attacked my mother, if I would be nonviolent in trying to protect her. If I would have nonviolent sentiments toward the person who attacked her. So we can talk about this. But when we are in such situations, if we lived in Syria, would we be nonviolent? To protect ourselves, to say nothing about people that we were responsible, if we lived in Syria. If somehow or other we were swindled out of our money, would we be nonviolent toward the swindler? I don't know. So again, it's easy enough to say this when life is going well. I remember when I was a child, we had autograph books. I must have been about 4th or 5th grade. That's when somebody would do something like this. And we shared our autograph books with our friends, and they would put very insightful sayings in the autograph book. Roses are red, violets are blue, and then fill it out. One time I asked my father to write in my autograph book. My father was great for sayings. And he wrote into my autograph book a poem I have never forgotten. Now, of course, when my father wrote in my book, it was corny. Now, when my friends wrote in the book, roses are red, violets are blue, that wasn't corny. But my father wrote something in that was corny. I've never forgotten it. And as I grew up, I realized, number one, my father was telling poetry, but also profound poetry, which I think fits into this reflection. And the poem was, it's easy enough to be happy when life flows along like a song, but the one worthwhile is the one who can smile when everything goes dead wrong. And he was writing poetry. It's the final verse of a Wisconsin poet. I only learned that years after my father died because I picked up a book of Wisconsin poets. And I read that and I thought, he was writing poetry to me and I didn't know it. But children, I think, almost by definition, take their parents for granted. Later on, I realized what an insightful man he was, besides being a gentleman. And besides executing justice out of his sense of mercy. But it's easy to do all these things when life is easy. But when life is hard, it's hard. Jesus seldom asked us to do easy things. My goodness, he asked us to transform the world. Somehow change the world in which we live. Now, in slight incremental ways. But executing justice is much easier than living out of mercy. And yet that's the story he gives us here. Be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful. The story demonstrates this. Giving mercy, acting mercifully, may be one of the most difficult things that we are called to do. Experiencing the mercy of God, as this year of mercy several years ago, was to alert us, was to remind us, was to call us to be merciful. And to be merciful as God is merciful. That's what this story is about. We have received the mercy of God freely given. We did not earn it. But do we give mercy? There is a story that I have heard, and it may simply be a parable used over and over again, but it's the story of a mother, of a son who has just been found guilty of a serious offense. And the mother goes to the judge and asks the judge for mercy for her son. It's understandable. Whether it ever happened at all, it's understandable. If it didn't happen, it certainly was desired. And the judge says to the mother, I can't just say your son can be free. That would be asking for mercy and not justice. And she said, but that's what I'm asking for, mercy, not justice. Now again, it's very easy for us to say the judge better not give mercy. The judge better give justice. The question is, in our lives, what does justice come from? Do we ask for a justice that comes from mercy, that does not wipe out the guilt, and that does not say that there has to be some kind of restoration, restoration, not respiration. It does not say that does not have to be some kind of restoration. It says there has to be justice, but justice that comes from mercy, not justice that comes from revenge. Much of our justice comes from revenge. So real mercy does not erase the need for justice. This is a great challenge for all of us. But this is the challenge of the story. Are we the servant who has a right to ask for something, but does not give mercy, ask for justice that comes from revenge? Because the man, the other servant, says, give me a chance to pay you back. He's not asking, wipe out the debt. He's asking, give me a chance to execute justice. But the man does not give mercy, giving the man a chance to be just. He asks for justice. And that's why he is punished by the master. That's why he is, if you will, not given mercy. So be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful. That is what Jesus is asking for. Jesus asked for nothing that he would not give. He asked us to look at him and to mirror him, and in our lifetime to manifest the religious sentiments that he has toward us. So, it's a very beautiful story. It's a very difficult story because of not what Jesus is asking for us, but how we interpret what Jesus is asking for us. Always remember, it is out of a sentiment. We want to be like God. There's something very important for us to remember, I think. Maybe it's an insight that many people have had a long time ago, but it's an insight that I have had only recently in a new way. And that is, in a certain sense, if we come from God, which I believe we do, we come from earth and we manifest within our material lives everything about earth. We manifest the stuff we're made of. We manifest a relationship we have with earth. That, you know, our desire to be warmed by the sun, our desire to eat, you know, the earth and breathe the earth. So we manifest all of that. We don't always think of that, but that's precisely, the way we act as material beings is the way earth acts because we are part of earth. But we're not just part of earth. We may come from earth, but also fundamentally in the core of our being, we come from God. Now again, understanding that if we come from God, then somehow or other there is something about us that either is like God or is of God, or both. We are wired for that. We are wired to want to be forgiven. We are wired to want to be accepted. It's very human for all of us. And anyone who says, I don't care, either doesn't know or doesn't admit the truth. So like God, we are wired to be merciful.